I never thought my own flesh and blood would trade a brother's soul for a few acres of dirt and a marble countertop," Elias whispered as he adjusted his filthy, grease-stained cap. Standing at the edge of the sprawling 5-acre estate in Georgia, he looked nothing like the man who had built an empire in London. His boots were held together by duct tape, and his coat smelled of wood smoke and old regrets. Across the manicured lawn, his younger brother Caleb stood on the porch, laughing while clinking a crystal glass of bourbon. Caleb didn't recognize the limping shadow at his gate. He saw only a nuisance, a stain on his perfect afternoon. As Elias reached for the iron latch, he saw something through the window that made his blood run cold. There, sitting on the mahogany desk, was their father's secret ledger, the one that should have been buried in the grave. Caleb wasn't just living in the house, he was erasing every footprint Elias had ever left behind. Elias felt the weight of the heavy iron gate against his palms as he pushed it open just an inch. The rusted hinges let out a low groan that sounded like a warning from the past. He stepped onto the gravel driveway, his worn-out boots crunching softly on the expensive gray stones that cost more per square foot than most people made it. A month. Every step felt like a betrayal of the man he used to be. He looked down at his hands, stained with the grime of a 3-day bus ride and the soot of cheap motels. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver pocket watch. It was the only thing he had left from their father. The glass was cracked and the ticking had stopped years ago, but the engraving on the back still glowed faintly in the afternoon sun. He remembered the day his father handed it to him, whispering that a man is only as good as the truth he keeps. Now, Elias was a ghost in his own home. He watched Caleb through the large French windows. His brother was pacing back and forth, holding a thick stack of legal documents. Jasmine joined him, her silk dress shimmering like a snake's skin. She pointed at the mahogany desk and laughed, a sharp sound that carried through the glass. Elias saw her pick up a fountain pen and mimic signing a paper with a flourish. They were celebrating something. They were celebrating a victory that had not been earned. Elias moved closer, hiding behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree that he had climbed as a child. The bark felt rough and familiar under his fingers. He needed to see that ledger. He needed to know if the rumors were true. A black SUV pulled into the circular driveway, its tires spitting gravel. Caleb looked up, his expression shifting from joy to annoyance. He signaled to a security guard standing near the garage. Elias realized he was running out of time. He had to leave a trail, a crumb for the vultures to find. He walked toward the porch and carefully placed the broken silver watch on the bottom step. He tucked his chin into his dirty collar and retreated into the shadows of the overgrown hedges just as the front door swung open. Caleb stepped out, his nose wrinkling in disgust as he caught the scent of wood smoke in the air. He looked down and saw the silver object glinting at his feet. His face went pale. He reached down and picked up the watch with trembling fingers. He turned it over and read the initials engraved on the back. His eyes darted around the yard, searching for a ghost. He didn't see Elias, but Elias saw the fear in his brother's eyes. It was a fear that only comes from a guilty conscience. Caleb whispered something to Jasmine, who had followed him outside. She looked at the watch and then spat on the ground. She told him it was just junk left by a drifter. But Caleb knew better. He clutched the watch so tight his knuckles turned white. He knew the ticking had stopped, but he felt like a countdown had just begun. Caleb stood frozen on the porch for what felt like an eternity, his fingers white as they gripped the tarnished silver watch. The silence of the Georgia evening felt heavy, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower and the pounding of his own heart. Jasmine stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the wood as she peered over his shoulder. She reached out to take the watch, but Caleb pulled his hand away instinctively. He looked toward the hedges where the shadows seemed to stretch like long, dark fingers reaching for the house. He felt watched. He felt judged. Jasmine scoffed and adjusted her diamond earring, telling him to stop acting like he had seen a ghost. She said it was probably just a trick by one of the neighbors or some homeless person who had found a piece of trash in the woods. But Caleb knew the weight of that silver. He knew the way the latch clicked with a specific, metallic snap that no imitation could replicate. He remembered their father sitting in the leather armchair in the study, winding this very watch every night at 7 o'clock. It was supposed to be in the mahogany casket, tucked into the breast pocket of the old man's Sunday suit. Caleb's breath came in short, jagged bursts. If the watch was here, then the grave was not the only thing that had been disturbed. Inside the house, the light from the crystal chandelier spilled across the hallway, illuminating the framed portrait of Elias that still hung near the stairs. In the painting, Elias looked confident and strong, the golden boy who could do no wrong. Caleb hated that look. He hated that even after 5 years of silence, his older brother's shadow still managed to darken the room. He shoved the watch into his pocket and marched back inside, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. He needed a drink. He headed straight for the mahogany desk, the one Elias had seen through the window. He moved the secret ledger aside and poured a glass of amber bourbon, his hand still shaking so much that the ice cubes rattled against the glass. Jasmine followed him, her eyes narrowing as she watched his every move. She told him that they had worked too hard to let a piece of old metal ruin their plans. They had the papers. They had the signatures. The bank would be finalizing the transfer of the remaining 20 acres by Friday morning. But Caleb wasn't listening. He walked over to the window and pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, plunging the room into a dim, artificial glow. He didn't see the pair of calm, steady eyes watching from the darkness of the garden. Elias sat motionless on a rusted garden bench, his heart aching not from the cold, but from the coldness of his brother's soul. He had seen the fear, but he had also seen the greed. He knew now that the letter he received in London wasn't just a warning. It was a cry for help from a house that was being hollowed out from the inside. He reached into his tattered coat and pulled out a small, handwritten note. It was from Mama Ruth, the only person who knew he was coming. The note said that the truth was hidden in plain sight, but the cost of finding it might be everything he had left. Elias looked up at the darkened windows of his childhood home. He realized that the man he was looking for wasn't just a greedy brother. Caleb was hiding something much worse than a stolen inheritance. There was a reason why the ledger was on the desk and why the silver watch had returned to haunt them both. As the first owl hooted in the distance, Elias began to realize that the trap he had set was already starting to close. But he wasn't the only one holding the rope. Elias watched from the tall grass as the heavy oak door groaned shut, leaving him in the cold Georgia night. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the pine trees and carrying the faint scent of rain. He shifted his weight, feeling the dampness of the earth through his thin soles. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp, metallic sound from the driveway. A massive black tow truck was backing into the property, its yellow lights flashing like a warning. Elias crouched lower as he saw a man step out of the shadows near the garage. It was not a stranger. It was Marcus, the former groundskeeper who had served their family for 20 years. But Marcus was not tending to the roses. He was handing a set of keys to the tow truck driver while pointing toward Elias' favorite vintage car, the one their father had promised him. Caleb appeared on the porch again, his face twisted in a sneer. He yelled for them to hurry up because the scrapyard would close in an hour. Elias felt a surge of cold fury. They were not just stealing the land, they were erasing the memories, one piece of steel at a time. Marcus looked toward the hedges, his eyes squinting as if he sensed a ghost watching him. He paused, his hand hovering over the driver's arm. At that moment, Jasmine walked out holding a large cardboard box. She tripped on the uneven porch step, and the box spilled open. Thousands of old family photographs scattered across the wet wood like fallen leaves. Instead of picking them up, she kicked a photo of Elias as a young boy into the mud. Caleb laughed and told her it was just more trash to burn. Elias gripped a stone so hard it cut into his palm. He realized then that his brother's greed had turned into something much more dangerous. They were destroying the evidence of his existence. If he did not act now, there would be nothing left to return to. Just as the tow truck started to pull the car away, a loud sirens echoed from the main road. Blue and red lights began to dance against the white pillars of the house. Caleb and Jasmine froze. The plan was moving faster than Elias expected, and the secret in his pocket was burning a hole through his rags. If you are as shocked as Elias by this betrayal, please hit the like button and subscribe to see how the truth unfolds. Are you watching this from New York, the sunny streets of Miami, or perhaps all the way from Johannesburg? Caleb scrambled to the edge of the porch, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as the flashing police lights bounced off his expensive silk shirt. Jasmine clutched his arm so hard her long manicured nails dug into his skin, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and calculation. The cruiser slowed to a crawl at the end of the driveway, but it did not turn in. Instead, it continued down the dark Georgia road, the sirens fading into a distant, lonely echo. Caleb let out a breath that sounded like a deflating balloon and leaned against a white pillar, his chest heaving. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and looked at the box of scattered photos on the wet ground. He told Jasmine to get a trash bag and clear the mess before the neighbors started asking questions. But Jasmine wasn't looking at the photos. She was looking at the silver watch Caleb still held tightly in his left hand. She whispered that if that watch was really on the porch, then someone was playing a very dangerous game with them. She reminded him that they had told the lawyers Elias was dead, lost at sea during a storm near the coast of England. If he was alive, or if someone found out they had lied on the legal affidavits, they wouldn't just lose the 50-acre estate. They would be wearing orange jumpsuits in a federal prison. Elias, hidden behind the thick trunk of the old oak tree, watched his brother crumble. He saw Caleb's hand tremble as he reached for the glass of bourbon he had left on the railing. The greed was still there, but now it was wrapped in a thick layer of cowardice. Elias reached into his pocket and touched the cold metal of a small digital recorder he had carried all the way from London. He had captured every word of their panicked confession. He felt a bitter satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by a stabbing pain in his heart. He had hoped, in some small corner of his soul, that Caleb would show a shred of remorse for their father's memory. Instead, his brother was only worried about the price of his own skin. Caleb suddenly snapped at Marcus, the groundskeeper, telling him to stop the tow truck and put the car back in the garage. He barked that they needed to be careful until the final deed was recorded at the county courthouse on Monday morning. Marcus nodded silently, his face unreadable as he signaled the driver. Elias knew he had to move. The warehouse where he had been sleeping was 5 miles away, and the temperature was dropping fast. But as he turned to slip through the back fence, he saw a light flicker in the small cottage at the far end of the property. It was the place where Mama Ruth lived. A shadow moved across the window, and for a split second, a candle was held against the glass. It was a signal. She knew he was there. She knew the storm was coming, and she was waiting for him to bring the lightning. Elias moved like a shadow across the wet grass, keeping his body low as he bypassed the main driveway and headed toward the small, weathered cottage tucked away behind the weeping willow trees. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine, but all Elias could smell was the stench of betrayal coming from the big house. He reached the wooden porch of the cottage and gave 3 soft, rhythmic knocks. The door creaked open almost immediately, and the warm glow of a single kerosene lamp spilled out, illuminating Mama Ruth's wrinkled, tear-streaked face. She gasped, covering her mouth with a trembling hand as she pulled him inside and bolted the door. She looked at his tattered clothes and the grime on his face, her heart breaking for the man she had raised like her own son. She whispered that she knew he would come back because a lion never leaves his pride to the hyenas. Elias sat at the small kitchen table, his eyes hard and focused as he asked her about the night their father died. Mama Ruth sat across from him, her voice a low, urgent murmur that cut through the silence of the room. She told him that the doctor's report Caleb showed the family was a lie. She explained that their father had been recovering well until the night Caleb and Jasmine arrived with a new set of lawyers and a bottle of expensive champagne. She had heard them arguing in the study, voices raised about a hidden safe and a second will that Elias was supposed to inherit. Mama Ruth reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, rusted key with a faded blue ribbon tied to it. She said their father had pressed it into her hand just hours before he breathed his last, telling her to keep it safe until the rightful heir returned. Elias took the key, feeling its cold weight in his palm. It was the key to the old tool shed near the creek, a place Caleb would never think to look because he considered it beneath him. Mama Ruth warned him that Caleb had hired private security to patrol the perimeter starting tomorrow morning, and that they were planning to bulldoze the shed to make room for a new swimming pool. Elias realized that the clock was ticking faster than he had imagined. Every minute he spent in the shadows was a minute Caleb used to bury the truth deeper into the ground. He looked back toward the main mansion, seeing the flickering blue light of a television through the library window. His brother was relaxing, thinking the war was already won. But as Elias gripped the rusted key, he knew that the real battle was only beginning. He told Mama Ruth to keep her lights off and her door locked. He was going to the shed, and what he found there would either restore his family's honor or destroy it forever. As he stepped back out into the night, the wind howled through the trees, sounding like a chorus of voices demanding justice for a dead man who could no longer speak for himself. Elias stepped off the porch of the cottage and vanished into the thick fog that was rolling in from the creek. The air was colder now, dropping below 40 degrees, and his breath appeared in small white clouds before disappearing into the night. He clutched the rusted key inside his pocket, its jagged edges pressing against his palm like a silent promise. He moved with the silence of a man who had spent years learning how to survive in the shadows. He avoided the main paths, stepping carefully over fallen pine needles to muffle the sound of his footsteps. As he approached the old tool shed, he saw a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness near the stables. It was a security guard, probably hired by Caleb to ensure no one interfered with the demolition crew scheduled for Monday morning. Elias froze against the rough bark of a cedar tree, his heart drumming against his ribs. He waited for the light to pass before sliding toward the shed's side door. The wood was gray and splintered, covered in thick vines of ivy that felt like cold snakes against his hands. He found the lock, heavy and caked with years of orange rust. He slipped the key in, praying that the tumblers would still turn, with a slow, agonizing creak that felt loud enough to wake the dead. The lock yielded. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him, plunging himself into total darkness. The air inside smelled of motor oil, dry earth, and old burlap. He did not dare use a light. Instead, he moved by memory, his fingers tracing the workbench where his father used to spend Saturday mornings fixing broken toys. He reached the back wall and began counting the floorboards from the left corner. 1, 2, 3, 4. He knelt and felt for the loose board that sat slightly lower than the others. He pried it up, his fingernails digging into the dirt underneath. His hand struck something hard and cold. It was a small metal lockbox wrapped in an oilcloth. This was the second will Mama Ruth had whispered about. Elias pulled it out, but as he did, he heard a heavy footstep on the porch outside. The floorboards of the shed groaned under a weight that was much heavier than a stray animal. A voice, low and gravelly, drifted through the cracks in the wood. It was Marcus. He wasn't talking to himself. He was on a radio, telling someone that he saw a movement near the creek and was going in to check. Elias realized that the groundskeeper he once trusted was now his primary hunter. He clutched the lockbox to his chest, realizing he was trapped. There was no back exit, and the security guard's flashlight was already shining through the gaps in the wall, illuminating the very spot where Elias was hiding. If he stayed, he would be caught with the evidence. If he ran, he would be a target in the open field. But then, he noticed something he had forgotten about. A small trapdoor beneath the workbench led to a narrow irrigation tunnel built 50 years ago. It was a desperate gamble, but as the door handle began to turn from the outside, Elias knew his time for hiding was over. Elias held his breath as the shadow of Marcus stretched across the dirt floor of the shed. The heavy footsteps paused right above the trapdoor, making the old wood groan under the pressure. Outside, the wind howled through the Georgia pines, sounding like a chorus of spirits watching the scene unfold. Elias pressed his back against the cold, damp earth of the narrow crawl space, clutching the metal lockbox to his chest. He could smell the metallic tang of the rusted irrigation pipes and the scent of damp clay above him. The shed door swung open with a violent slam against the outer wall. Marcus grumbled about the weather, his heavy boots thumping just inches from Elias' head. The beam of a high-powered flashlight cut through the gaps in the floorboards, sweeping across the darkness like a searchlight. Elias watched a single spider crawl across the oilcloth, wrapping the box, its tiny legs moving in the artificial glare. He knew that if he breathed too loud, the game would be over. Marcus kicked a pile of empty burlap sacks, swearing under his breath about Caleb's paranoia. He muttered that there was nobody here but ghosts and shadows. Then, the ground shook as Marcus stepped directly onto the loose board Elias had pried up moments before. The board tipped, and the flashlight beam dropped straight into the hole. Elias closed his eyes, expecting the shout of discovery, but instead, Marcus tripped, his heavy body crashing against the workbench with a loud thud. A jar of old nails shattered on the floor, sending a spray of sharp metal everywhere. Marcus cursed loudly, nursing what sounded like a bruised neigh. He growled into his radio that the place was a death trap and he was heading back to the main house for a real drink. The heavy door slammed shut, and the sound of retreating footsteps faded into the rustle of the pines. Elias waited for 5 long minutes, his heart thumping against his ribs like a trapped bird. He finally crawled through the narrow tunnel, pushing through thick cobwebs and piles of dry leaves until he emerged near the creek bank. The water was black and cold, rushing over jagged stones 3 feet below the ridge. He sat in the mud, gasping for air, and looked down at the lockbox. He managed to pry the lid open just enough to see a thick envelope sealed with red wax. On the front, in his father's steady, elegant handwriting, were the words for Elias, the son who understood the value of a promise. He felt a tear track through the dirt on his cheek. He had the proof, but as he looked toward the mansion, he saw the garage doors opening. Caleb and Jasmine were getting into the SUV, dressed in expensive coats. They weren't going to sleep. They were headed toward the county recorder's office to file the forged papers before the sun came up. Elias realized that his victory was still miles away, and he was nothing but a beggar in a ditch while the thieves were driving toward the finish line. Elias sat in the cold mud of the creek bank, his fingers trembling as he clutched the lockbox against his chest. The heavy roar of the black SUV's engine faded in the distance, leaving him in a crushing silence that felt like a funeral shroud. He looked down at his filthy rags and the duct tape peeling off his boots. He was a billionaire with an empire in London, but in this moment, he was just a ghost standing in a ditch while thieves drove away with his life. The weight of the situation crashed down on him like a physical blow. He realized he had no car, no phone, and no one would believe a man who smelled of wood smoke and garbage. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. The path to the county courthouse was 15 miles of winding Georgia backroads. By the time he walked there, the sun would be up and the documents would be sealed. Caleb and Jasmine would win. They would own the land, the house, and every memory of his father. He felt a wave of absolute hopelessness wash over him. He had the truth in his hands, but the world was designed to ignore people who looked like him. He looked at the red wax seal on the envelope and felt like a failure. He had let his father down. He had let Mama Ruth down. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the dark woods, followed by a low rumble of thunder that shook the ground. The rain began to fall again, cold and relentless, soaking through his thin coat in seconds. Elias slumped against a wet cedar tree, closing his eyes. He was at the bottom. He was broken. But just as he prepared to give up, a pair of headlights cut through the fog near the old back gate. A battered white pickup truck slowed to a crawl, its engine sputtering. The driver's side window rolled down, and a familiar face peered into the darkness. It was Marcus. But he wasn't alone. Mama Ruth was in the passenger seat, her eyes fierce and determined. Marcus didn't say a word about the lockbox or the rags Elias was wearing. He simply kicked open the passenger door and told Elias to get in because they had a long drive ahead of them. Elias realized then that he wasn't fighting this battle by himself. The low point had passed. and the first spark of a counterattack was beginning to glow in the dark cabin of that old truck. The old white pickup truck roared to life, its engine shaking the very ground beneath Elias' muddy boots. He climbed into the cabin, the smell of lavender and old peppermint from Mama Ruth's apron acting as a sudden anchor to his drifting soul. Marcus slammed the truck into gear and spun the wheels, kicking up red Georgia clay as they peeled away from the creek gate. The rain was now a relentless curtain of gray water, blurring the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up with the storm. Elias sat in the middle, clutching the lockbox so tightly his knuckles were white and bloodless. He looked at Mama Ruth's, whose face remained as steady as a stone monument in the dim green light of the dashboard. She didn't ask him where he had been for 5 years or why he looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave. She simply reached over and placed her warm, calloused hand over his, whispering that the truth has a way of finding its own path home. Marcus pushed the truck to 60 miles per hour, the headlights cutting through the fog like twin swords. He told Elias that Caleb and Jasmine had a 20-minute head start and were likely already pulling into the county administration building in downtown Savannah. They were planning to meet a crooked notary who had been on their payroll since the funeral. Elias felt the urgency burning in his chest like hot coals. He opened the lockbox and pulled out the thick envelope, breaking the red wax seal with a steady thumb. Inside was not just a will, but a series of color photographs and a handwritten confession from their father's primary physician. The doctor had documented every visit and every threat Caleb had made to change the medical records. But there was something else, a small, shimmering object tucked at the bottom of the box. It was a digital thumb drive with a label that read, "The Final Conversation." Elias realized his father had known. The old man had recorded the very moment Caleb tried to force him to sign the forged papers. As the truck hit a massive pothole, Elias looked out the window and saw the glow of the city lights on the horizon. He wasn't just a beggar anymore. He was a man armed with the one thing Caleb feared more than poverty: the absolute, undeniable truths. Marcus took a sharp turn, the tires screaming on the wet asphalt, and Elias saw the black SUV parked directly in front of the courthouse. Caleb and Jasmine were already on the steps, shaking hands with a man in a dark suit. The clock was ticking down to the final second, and Elias knew that once those papers were stamped, the lie would become law. He gripped the door handle, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, preparing himself to step out of the shadows and into the light of a reckoning that was 5 years late. Marcus brought the battered white truck to a bone-jarring halt just 30 feet behind the black SUV, the tires splashing a wall of muddy water against the stone steps of the courthouse. The heavy rain continued to drum against the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. But inside the cabin, the silence was absolute. Elias stared through the blurred glass at his brother Caleb, who was laughing and shaking hands with a man in a sharp charcoal suit. Jasmine stood beside them, preening in her fur coat, looking like she had already won the lottery. They were leaning over a mahogany table set up under the sheltered portico, the final deed waiting for the ink to dry. Elias looked down at his filthy, grease-stained hands and then at the digital thumb drive sitting on his lap. He felt a wave of nausea, not from fear, but from the sheer coldness of their greed. Mama Ruth reached over and adjusted his tattered collar, her eyes burning with a quiet, ancient fire. She whispered that the time for hiding in the shadows was over and that the ancestors were demanding their due. Elias pushed the heavy truck door open, the cold Georgia air hitting his face like a physical slap. He stepped out into the rain, his duct-taped boots squelching in the mud as he walked toward the light of the portico. Caleb was the first to notice the figure approaching. He stopped laughing, his face twisting into a mask of disgust as he looked at the man he thought was just a nameless beggar. He barked at the security guard to get the trash off the property, pointing his finger at Elias with a trembling rage. Jasmine scoffed, telling the notary that this was exactly why they needed to fence off the estate, to keep out the derelicts and the ghosts. But as Elias climbed the final step and stood under the bright fluorescent lights, he didn't look away. He didn't beg. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver watch Caleb had dropped on the porch earlier that evening. The metal glinted under the lights, and Caleb's breath caught in his throat. His knees buckled slightly, and he reached for the edge of the table to steady himself. The notary looked confused, asking if they knew this man. Caleb tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp, a broken sound that couldn't form words. Elias walked right up to the mahogany table, ignored the security guard's reaching hand, and placed the silver watch directly on top of the forged deed. He looked his brother in the eye, the same eyes that had watched over him when they were children, and saw nothing but a hollow shell. Jasmine tried to snatch the papers away, but Elias slammed his hand down, pinning the documents to the table. He leaned in close, his voice low and vibrating with a power that shook Caleb to his core. He told them that he had heard every word they said in the study, and that the grave had finally given up its secrets. He pulled the digital thumb drive from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. The notary's eyes widened as Elias stated that he was the rightful heir, the son they had declared dead, and that the party was officially over. Caleb looked at the drive, then at the watch, and finally at the man in the rags. He realized that the ghost he had been running from wasn't in the graveyard. He was standing right in front of him, holding the rope that was about to pull his entire world down. The notary stared at the digital thumb drive as if it were a ticking time bomb, his hand frozen midair. Caleb's face had drained of all color, turning a ghostly shade of gray that matched the stormy Georgia sky outside. He tried to reach for the drive, his fingers trembling and clumsy, but Elias was faster. Elias stepped back, his muddy boots leaving a defiant trail on the expensive marble floor. He looked at his brother and saw a stranger, a man who had sold his soul for 50 acres of timber and a house full of shadows. Jasmine began to scream that this was a setup, that the man standing before them was just a crazy drifter who had stolen a dead man's belongings. She turned to the security guard and demanded that he throw Elias back into the rain. But the guard did not move. He was looking at Marcus, who had walked up the steps and was standing right behind Elias like a mountain of silent justice. Marcus cleared his throat and told the notary that he had witnessed the true will being signed 3 years ago in that very study. He explained that Caleb had threatened to put their father in a state nursing home if he did not change the documents. The notary, sensing the shift in power, pulled the forged deed toward him and placed it inside a protective folder. He told Caleb that all transactions were suspended until the district attorney could review the contents of that drive. Jasmine's knees buckled, and she sank into one of the plush lobby chairs, her silk dress fluttering like the wings of a trapped moth. She started to sob, but there was no regret in her voice, only the sound of someone who had lost a bet. Caleb looked around the room, searching for an exit, but the walls of his own greed were closing in. Elias felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The anger that had fueled his journey from London had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard clarity. He told the notary that there were also medical records from the family physician on that drive, proving that their father's medication had been withheld to weaken his mind. Caleb's eyes went wide with a new kind of terror. This was no longer just about money. This was about a crime that could not be washed away by a fancy lawyer. Elias walked over to his brother and leaned in close, so close that Caleb could smell the wood smoke and the Georgia rain on his coat. He whispered that the house was never the prize, but the truth was. He told Caleb that by sunrise, the police would be at the mansion to collect the rest of the evidence. Elias turned his back on them and walked toward the glass doors. He saw Mama Ruth waiting in the truck, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the dashboard. He realized that for 5 years, he had been building an empire across the ocean, but the only thing that mattered was the dirt under his boots and the people who never stopped believing in his name. The storm outside was finally beginning to break, and a single sliver of moonlight cut through the clouds, lighting the path back to the home that was finally his again. The rain had finally slowed to a gentle mist as the first pale light of dawn began to touch the tops of the Georgia pines. Elias stood on the courthouse steps, watching the local sheriff lead Caleb and Jasmine toward a waiting patrol car. Caleb's head was bowed, his expensive silk shirt soaked and clinging to his shoulders, while Jasmine stared blankly at the ground. The diamond rings on her fingers no longer shining in the gray light. The notary followed them out, clutching the real will and the digital drive like they were the most precious objects in the world. He stopped next to Elias and whispered that justice had been slow, but it had finally arrived. Elias did not feel the joy he expected. Instead, he felt a deep, quiet peace that started in his chest and spread to his very fingertips. He walked down to the white pickup truck where Mama Ruth was waiting. She opened the door and handed him a clean, warm towel and a thermos of hot coffee. She told him that his father could finally rest easy now because the house was no longer a cage of lies. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the familiar rumble sounding like a song of victory. As they drove back toward the estate, Elias looked at the 50 acres of land that now belonged to him again. He saw the old tool shed and the weeping willow trees, and he knew exactly what he had to do. He would not live in the mansion alone. He told Mama Ruth that the big house would be turned into a sanctuary for families who had been displaced by greed, a place where no one would ever have to feel like a ghost in their own home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver watch one last time. He wound the dial, and for the first time in years, the steady, rhythmic ticking filled the cabin of the truck. The heart of the family was beating once more. As the sun broke over the horizon, turning the red clay into gold, Elias realized that his journey as a beggar had taught him more about wealth than his years as a billionaire ever could. He was finally home, and this time, the doors would stay open for everyone. We have seen that truth always finds its way to the light, no matter how deep it is buried. Please like and subscribe if you believe that justice should always prevail for those who stay faithful. If you were in Elias' shoes, would you have forgiven your siblings, or is some betrayal too deep to ever forget? Share your thoughts in the comments below,